I got to start with those jobs numbers out on Friday. When they crossed, I actually thought maybe they were wrong. This is extraordinary. 517,000 jobs we're adding, given where we are already.
It's a huge miss relative to the consensus. It's way out of line with what you'd have expected with ADP. The labor market's running very differently than lots of other indicators in the economy, where you see some signs, particularly in manufacturing, of real slowing. So it's a pretty confused picture. One idea would be that people are still worried about how much work they're going to get out of their workforces, given people working at home, given increased absenteeism, given a variety of post-COVID changes. And so they just feel that whenever they can get workers, they should take the opportunity. But it sure does seem like we have a lot of workers relative to the amount of demand we have or amount of production we have in the economy. And the question is all this going to be income that's going to be spent, that's going to lift the economy up a bunch? Is it going to turn out that at some point people realize they've got too much inventory and labor, and we're going to see a fairly sudden stop? I think it's as difficult an economy to read as I can remember. A year ago at this time, I was pretty confident about what the principal imbalances were and how things were going to play out. I don't have that kind of confidence right now.
Can we have this sort of addition to the job market and not have wages go up more than we thought? They went up 4.4%. This is year over year now on the monthly, which was 0.1% more than expected, but it wasn't that dramatic. Are we going to have wage inflation kick in here that will really give us problems once again on monetary policy?
David, that's a basic question. I went back and looked at the forecasting model emphasizing vacancies that I had used a year ago to predict that we were headed for significant wage inflation problems. And what I found was quite interesting to me. What I found was that that model is predicting wage inflation right now just about right, but it substantially underpredicted wage inflation in the latter part of 2022. So we saw an acceleration beyond what models would have predicted that in 2022. We saw that, I now realize, with respect to wages, just as we saw that with respect to prices. And the central question is, we had some easy come, and now it's come off very quickly, inflation. And the question now is whether that inflation is going to continue to decline rapidly, continuing the trend of the last few months, or whether the inflation that was never really predicted by models was, in a sense, ultimately transitory, but now we're left with an underlying inflation that's going to be much more difficult to get out of the economy. And if the latter is the case, we're going to have a more difficult set of challenges in achieving the proverbial soft landing. If the former is the case, then there may be a more natural glide path to a soft landing. And I think it's very difficult to know. So it's really a question about whether there's two categories of inflation: easy come, easy go inflation and underlying base inflation, or whether we can infer a lot from the progress of the last few months. And that's something that I think one has to remain agnostic about.
And the difficulties you described, Larry, sit right on the desk of Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed, from whom we heard, of course, this week in connection with their decision. Last week, before we heard from him, you were on this program saying it's what the Fed has is sort of like a car on a foggy night, and basically you got to keep the foot close to the accelerator and close to the brake. And this is actually what your friend and colleague Paul Krugman had to say, reacting to what you had to say.
This really disturbs me to say this, but I think I agree with Larry. Yeah, we could, we will get it wrong one way or the other, and there's a reasonable chance in either direction.
So, Larry, you disturbed your friend Paul Krugman because he actually agreed with you. But at the same time, do you think Powell did exactly what you were describing? Did he keep his foot sort of close to both the brake and the accelerator without going too far either direction?
I think the Fed's doing a good job of portraying substantial uncertainty in the economy, recognizing that it's going to be very hard and one's going to have to try to interpret the data month by month, and that there are a lot of surprises. I think they're having a difficult time convincing markets on their determination and with respect to the path towards the end of the year. I probably still think the risks that the two-part theory I just laid out is true, and that the inflation reductions will be transitory. I think that risk is greater than I think the Fed thinks it is. I do still think there is the risk that I've talked about earlier on the show of a kind of Wile E. Coyote moment where firms realize they've got too much inventory and too many people, and that you see a more economy-wide turn to adjustment of the kind you've seen in the relatively limited, in terms of employment, technology sector. But that's certainly anything but a confident prediction.
Larry, let's turn from the central bank, actually the executive branch, and the White House, where there's a big change going on in the staff there. Ron Klain, the chief of staff, has left. Also, Brian Deese, with whom I know you've worked personally very closely. What do you think about their tenure? And as important, what does President Biden now need going forward?
I think Ron Klain as chief of staff and Brian Deese as head of the NEC have very proud legacies they can look back on. This administration, with a very small set of margins in the Senate and in the House, probably passed more economic legislation in its first 2 years than any administration in more than 2 generations. There are, to be sure, real and serious issues with inflation, but I don't think anybody would have predicted an economy quite as strong as the one in the labor market, at least, that we are seeing right now. So they've got an enormous amount to be proud of, as does Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who will fortunately be continuing in her position and will provide, I think, some hugely important stability for the economy. But Ron Klain and Brian Deese should be and are leaving with their heads held very high. And of course, one has to give enormous credit to the president, who relied on them to really push forward a set of very bold policies.
And finally, Larry, give us a minute on antitrust. We've talked in the past about Lina Khan, the chair of the FTC, and her new approach to antitrust. She tried it out in court, trying to stop, actually, Meta from making an acquisition of a small virtual reality startup, and was rebuffed by the court. What do you make of that?
I'm worried about overambition in antitrust policy. This isn't the first or the second or the third time that our antitrust authorities have lost in court for overstepping. I've heard stories that they are trying to ask so many questions about mergers, even when they don't think they're going to have a strong legal argument, the deadlines are passed and the mergers don't happen. That's not the way it should happen in a country that's governed by the rule of law. Now, I don't know for sure whether those stories are true, but I think here at halftime in the administration, it'd be a good idea for the antitrust authorities to step back and focus on their highest priorities, because I think there's the real risk that excess ambition will bring us the worst of all worlds. It will chill business confidence. It will divert attention from cases that could be won, and it will discredit necessary steps with respect to concentration.